Barbara Villarreal was killed on the night of November 7, 1986. On the night of November 7, 1986, a crime shook the tranquil suburbs of Garland, Texas, a working-class community just northeast of Dallas. For decades, the murder would remain a mystery. Barbara Fay Carr Villarreal, 36, was savagely stabbed to death inside a little brick house on a tree-lined lane. It wasn't simply a killing. It was a type of terrible crime that rips a town apart and stays in whispers for years. Barbara wasn't a big deal to the people who lived next door. She was a known face, a mother, a wife, and a woman who had her life snatched in the most personal, brutal manner possible, inside her own house. Before we get farther into Barbara Fay's story, I need to ask you something. If you've been listening intently, taking in every detail, experiencing even a fraction of the terror and weight of this atrocity, then remember this. There are many tales like Barbara's throughout America, and far too many of them never see the light of day. By liking this video and subscribing, you make sure that tales like hers are not forgotten, that the victims' identities live on, and that the truth continues to reach the people who need to hear it. If you followed this case with your complete attention, do the right thing. Subscribe today. Stay with us, for what happens next is much more frightening. If you look away, if you scroll by, then voices like Barbara's risk being lost to quiet all over again. The time frame is very, very clear. Records from the Garland police and the Dallas County Court reveal that officers were sent following a desperate cry for aid. What authorities discovered inside the house was terrible when they got there. Barbara's corpse revealed several stab wounds, signs not of a rapid assault, but of passion, personal brutality, and purpose. This wasn't a tidy crime of opportunity. It was awful. There were no traces of forced entry, no clear burglary. Whoever had slain Barbara had either known her or been comfortable enough to breach the threshold of her house. The home itself became the first silent witness. The kitchen countertops, the chairs, the floor, all marred with evidence of a struggle, of fear, of unexpected disarray that burst into violence. The initial suspect in practically every murder is generally the spouse. Investigators turned their sights to Barbara's husband. He was questioned, probed, and in the weeks following, absolved of wrongdoing. For investigators in 1986, clearing him was vital. It meant this wasn't the narrative of a personal argument gone deadly. It was something else, something tougher to pin down. What the detectives did have was blood evidence, a sample they meticulously obtained at the murder site. But in 1986, forensic science was still immature compared to today. DNA testing, as we know it today, was only starting to find its way into courtrooms. In fact, the first criminal conviction in the U.S. based on DNA evidence didn't even happen until 1987. For Garland investigators, the blood was more of a hopeful souvenir than a viable lead. Leads fizzled. Witnesses had nothing meaningful. No weapon surfaced. The city went on as cities do. But Barbara's case stayed like a ghost nailed to the evidence racks. Every so often, investigators reviewed the file. They'd flick through aging papers, crime scene images, and lab data, hoping any detail could spark a solution. But nothing ever did. Barbara's family lived with it. Her children grew up bearing the weight of knowing their mother's murderer had never been apprehended. Neighbors who recalled that November night would talk of it in quiet tones, dropping their voices as if the crime itself still held a chill. For decades, the blood sample remained silently in storage, carrying the solution, but imprisoned behind the restrictions of time. To grasp the singularity of this case, you have to set it in the Dallas County of the mid-1980s. The crime rate was high. Dallas was becoming infamous for violent violence, narcotics, and gang troubles sweeping across its suburbs. Garland, however smaller and more suburban, was not exempt. But a suburban house stabbing like Barbara's? That was unusual. It stood out because it didn't match the patterns of gang violence, random burglary, or street crime. It was personal, and personal crimes are typically the toughest to solve without a confession or a witness. What cops said was a murder weapon unseen, a suspect unknown, and a blood sample decades ahead of its utility. At the time, forensic investigators could compare blood types, but they couldn't distinguish a distinct person. Blood type may restrict a pool of possibilities, but it couldn't solve a case. DNA technology was on the horizon, but in 1986 it was unreliable, unproven, and unavailable to most local police agencies. Dallas County prosecutors couldn't take dubious science into court, so they waited, and Barbara's case froze in time. For Barbara's family, the pain never healed. Her children had to grow up knowing their mother's murderer had never been punished. For her siblings and relatives, it was a continuous reminder that justice had failed them. Holidays passed with an empty chair at the table. Birthdays came and went with the obvious lack of a mother's voice. And yet, somewhere in that familial circle sat the true murderer. Unknown, undetected, hiding in plain sight. That's the terrifying part. The killer wasn't a stranger lurking in the shadows. He wasn't some faceless boogeyman. He was a member of the same family Barbara belonged to. But the fact wouldn't be found until almost 4 decades later. It's simple for outsiders to question why cops didn't solve it back then. But in 1986, situations like these were virtually tough to solve without a confession. No cameras on street corners. No smartphones. No Ring doorbells. No forensic genealogy. Police had just witnessed testimony, fingerprints, and blood type. If none of them matched, you were out of luck. And that's precisely what occurred. The case was branded a cold case, one of many stacking up in Garland and Dallas County during that decade. But through it all, one piece of evidence never lost its voice: the blood retrieved from a site. That blood stayed in storage for years, decades even, like a time capsule waiting for science to evolve. Inside it, coated in its threads, was the identity of a murderer. Investigators didn't know it then, but that one sample would ultimately crack open a case, outlasting practically every investigator who originally investigated the file. Garland moved on. The late 1980s gave way to the 1990s, and new crimes deserved fresh attention. Detectives retired. New policemen took over. Barbara's file was passed down like a cursed legacy, a reminder of a failure they couldn't escape. And yet, with every passing year, technology grew closer to being able to answer the question the city had been asking since 1986: who murdered Barbara Villarreal? For the community, unsolved killings bear a special weight. They don't fade like solved crimes. They remain half-told tales, with no finish, just whispers. Barbara's situation became one of them. People who remembered her murmured about it. Neighbors speculated. Some suspected maybe her spouse had been involved despite the police clearing him. Others thought it was a stranger. Nobody suspected the truth. For Dallas County prosecutors, the case was a blemish, an open wound in their records, stamped unresolved for over 40 years. But time in this scenario wasn't an adversary. It was an accomplice to justice. Because with time came forensic genealogy, a technology strong enough to reach backward across decades and draw criminals out of hiding. For almost 4 decades, the blood collected from the floor of Barbara Villarreal's Garland, Texas house stayed locked in an evidence locker. Every time a fresh investigator took a glimpse at the case file, they found the same thing printed across it: unsolved. And yet within that file was something unique. A bit of Barbara's killer, trapped in time, concealed in that blood. The technology of the 1980s couldn't unravel its mysteries. Even the 1990s and 2000s, with their breakthroughs in DNA research, nevertheless fell short of what this case needed. But ultimately in the 2020s, science caught up. And when it did, it altered everything. That blood sample wasn't merely evidence. It was a quiet witness. Think about it. Every cell, every strand of DNA within it was shouting the truth about who murdered Barbara. The trouble was, in 1986, nobody understood how to listen. DNA testing was in its infancy. Police could identify blood type, They might compare wide markers, but they couldn't identify one single individual out of millions. The science simply wasn't there. So investigators preserved it, identifying it, keeping it as well as they could, never completely knowing whether they'd ever have another opportunity to make it talk. That opportunity came decades later, when science provided police a tool more powerful than fingerprints, more exact than eyewitness evidence, and more devastating than any alibi. That tool was investigative genetic genealogy. To the ordinary American, the word genetic genealogy could seem like something out of a biology textbook or a family history hobby gone too far. Here's how it works. Detectives take DNA gathered from a crime scene. In this example, the blood left behind after Barbara was stabbed in her own house, and then analyze it using modern sequencing. That provides a DNA profile more complete than the fragmentary profiles investigators used to depend on in the early 2000s. These folks weren't suspects. They weren't criminals. They were amateurs, men and women seeking for long-lost relatives, establishing family trees, or tracing back their Irish, Italian, or Mexican ancestry. But those family trees become crime-solving roadmaps. If a murderer's relative uploaded their DNA to a genealogy site, it meant police could discover the cousin, follow the family tree backward, and then forward again until they got on the killer himself. It's digital detective work coupled with old-school family history. And in the instance of Barbara Villarreal, it was the breakthrough Dallas County had been waiting for. By 2023, Dallas County had discreetly began re-examining previous cold cases with new eyes. The Villarreal murder was one of them. Investigators knew the blood was still preserved. They understood forensic laboratories now had the capacity to develop considerably more precise DNA profiles than ever before. And so over 40 years after the night Barbara was stabbed to death in her Garland home, forensic experts put that decades-old blood sample under their equipment. The findings were startling. Not only did the DNA profile come back strong, but it was usable in ways no investigator in 1986 could have ever anticipated. It wasn't simply a random series of marks anymore. It was a whole genetic fingerprint, detailed enough to be traced across generations of family lines. When detectives ran the profile through genealogy databases, they obtained hits, not on the murderer himself, but on family. Suddenly, names began surfacing. Distant cousins, a second cousin once removed. People spread throughout the nation, joined not by crime, but by DNA. Detectives started doing what genealogists do, establishing a family tree. It wasn't easy. These trees go back decades, with hundreds of branches. But with patience, names, and dates, the branches constricted. One familial line in particular stood out. The DNA led them not to a stranger, not to some mysterious character from outside the family, but within, toward Barbara's own circle, toward her brother-in-law. The individual detectives honed down on was Liborio Canales, 86 years old at the time of his arrest in 2023. Canales was living peacefully in New Mexico. He wasn't a name the initial investigators had brought forward in the late 1980s. He wasn't the focus of neighborhood gossip, but the DNA didn't lie. Piece by piece, branch by branch, the genealogical jigsaw all led back to him. The blood retrieved from the murder site in 1986 matched his family line, and subsequently, his own DNA. That meant only one thing. The murderer had been family all along. When the news broke, it wasn't simply about solving a cold case. It was about the treachery disguised in the answer. Barbara Villarreal had been slain not by a stranger, not by some prowler in the night, but by the guy who was meant to be family, for her surviving family. Such news was nearly worse than the initial crime. To know that the murderer had sat among them, eaten meals, attended family occasions, and stayed quiet for over 4 decades. It was a second wound laid over the first. DNA alone doesn't come into court and talk. It needs to be stated, spelled out, and demonstrated in a manner jurors can grasp. In Dallas County, prosecutors structured their case around this cutting-edge technique, making this the first ever murder conviction in the county's history utilizing forensic genealogy. That provided the case not just emotional weight for Barbara's family, but historical weight for Dallas County law enforcement. It established that no case, no matter how cold, was completely beyond grasp. Why this case stands out. The novelty of the Villarreal case isn't only that it was solved decades later. It's the confluence of old and new. 1986. Detectives could only gather and preserve evidence, praying for a future that may never arrive. 2023. Investigators utilized the full might of genetic research, drawing a murderer out of hiding after almost 40 years. It was a warning that murderers may escape the police of their own time, but they cannot outrun progress. The discovery that Barbara's murderer was her brother-in-law is the horrifying last twist in this tragedy. For over 40 years, Laborio Canales roamed free. He aged, he lived, he changed states. He blended into the calm rhythms of life, while the family of the lady he killed mourned without answers. And yet, all that time, the truth was resting on a shelf in a Garland police evidence room, waiting for science to catch up. This case is more than simply another solved murder. It's a landmark. By achieving a conviction using investigative genetic genealogy, Dallas County joins a growing number of jurisdictions throughout America, showing that IGG is not simply a tool for amateurs. It's a weapon for justice. From the Golden State Killer in California to Barbara Villarreal's murder in Texas, IGG has redefined the laws of cold case investigations. It offers a disturbing warning to murderers who believe time is on their side. You may hide for decades, but DNA doesn't forget. When Dallas County prosecutors stepped before the court in 2024 and announced the conviction of 86-year-old Laborio Canales, it wasn't simply about closing case. It was about delivering Barbara Villarreal's family the justice they had been denied for over 4 decades. It was about displaying the capacity of science to bridge the gap between history and present. And it was about establishing that even the coldest of cases may flame hot again when DNA is given the opportunity to speak. What began on November 7, 1986, as a brutal, senseless killing inside a suburban home in Garland, Texas, ended nearly 40 years later with the unmasking of the killer. Thanks to the quiet persistence of investigators, the preservation of a single drop of blood, and the unstoppable march of science. The knock came on a peaceful July morning in 2023. In a community just beyond the New Mexico state border, morning was still breaking over the mesas when police officers pounced on the little house where an old man lived out what looked to be an uneventful retirement. His neighbors knew him as Laborio Canales, an old person who kept himself, went slowly in and out of his tiny property, and never once hinted at the type of brutality buried deep in his background. But on that morning, the quiet broke. Unmarked cars pulled into the cul-de-sac, and plainclothes police with Dallas County warrants approached his house. Behind their quiet, methodical gestures was decades of despair and suffering, ultimately converted into an unbreakable confidence. This was not simply another arrest. It was a culmination of 37 years of waiting, for a family, for a city, and for the legal system itself. When Canales answered the door, bewildered by the abrupt incursion of strangers onto his doorstep, he was confronted with words that stopped time. Laborio Canales, you're under arrest for the 1986 murder of Barbara Villarreal in Garland, Texas. The old guy blinked, astonished. His face, wrinkled with the wrinkles of age, exhibited little expression. He didn't resist. Perhaps deep down he knew the day would come. Perhaps he assumed the grave would have taken him before it happened. But instead, the shackles snapped over his wrists, steel piercing into paper-thin flesh that had avoided consequence for too long. Neighbors murmured afterward that they had no clue, that he appeared peaceful, maybe even nice. Some noticed transient peculiarities, the way he avoided eye contact, the way he carried himself with a tightness that didn't suit his years. But no one could have predicted that in 1986 he had stood over his own sister-in-law, knife in hand, and left her to die in a pool of blood on her bedroom floor. When cops drove him away, the past appeared to fall inward. For detectives who had hung onto Barbara's case file all those years, the arrest meant everything. Some had since retired. Others had carried the unresolved case as a personal burden. The images from that night in November 1986, the blood, the pandemonium, the unexpected breaking of a family, had tormented them for decades. Now, with Canales in prison, the impossible had been accomplished. The DNA samples proved what investigative genetic genealogy had previously pointed to. The blood at the scene, kept in evidence all these years, was his. The science that didn't exist back then had now caught up with him. By the time March 2024 came, Dallas County was watching. The courtroom where Canales appeared was filled with reporters, family members, and interested observers who realized that this was more than just another matter on the docket. This was Dallas County's first murder conviction utilizing forensic genealogy, a legal milestone that would be researched, acknowledged, and remembered. Canales trudged into the courtroom in chains, clothed in a standard-issue jumpsuit. At 86 years old, he appeared feeble, but the weight of the charge made him loom bigger than life. Across the aisle sat members of Barbara Villarreal's family, many with silver hair themselves now, enduring the sadness of almost 4 decades. For them, this moment was not simply about punishment. It was about finally hearing the system declare out loud what they had always known, that Barbara's life had worth, and that her murderer had a name. The prosecution spelled it out plainly. The blood taken in 1986 had spoken. Its mute testimony kept until science acquired the skills to listen. The genetic genealogy technique had tracked the DNA via family trees, distant cousins, and databases, until zeroing in on Canales. He had lived with the secret for so long, blending into the background of family gatherings, daily routines, and later, the stillness of old age. But his history had not disappeared. It had been resting in a frozen lab drawer, waiting for the day the world could decipher it. And then came the moment no one anticipated. In March 2024, Canales did not drag the matter through a protracted trial. He pled guilty. Gasps reverberated around the courtroom. To hear such remarks from the guy himself was strange. For decades, suspicion had floated in whispers, speculations had circulated. But no one had ever heard him confess to anything. Now, in a voice weakened by age, he told the truth. He had slain Barbara for the Villarreal family. The admission was a dagger of its own, cruel, agonizing, but also a peculiar sort of healing. It wasn't simply the state demonstrating it. It was him saying it. When the judge pronounced the punishment, 20 years in jail, the courtroom sank into a profound stillness. On paper, 20 years can appear tiny compared to the gravity of taking a life. But for an 86-year-old man, it was practically a life sentence. He would spend the rest of his days in a jail cell, bereft of the comfort he had enjoyed while Barbara's memory existed only in images and silent grieving. The judge's gavel struck down, and with it, almost 4 decades of stillness ended. As he was brought away, handcuffed and stooping, Canales looked once toward the gallery where Barbara's family sat. No words went between them. There was nothing left to say. For the family, that was not the finale they desired. Nothing could bring Barbara back. But it was an ending anyway. They had survived 37 years of birthdays without Mom, holidays with an empty chair, anniversaries that seemed more like scars. Now they had something they could hold to, the knowledge that he had been held responsible. For Dallas County, the lawsuit became more than simply justice for one person. It became evidence of the strength of science, the tenacity of investigators, and the unbroken thread of truth that can run through decades of darkness. The tale grabbed headlines throughout Texas and resonated across the true crime community nationally. But for those closest to it, the headlines weren't the goal. The objective was closure. The idea was knowing that Barbara's narrative didn't go into a forgotten file box. When Laborio Canales was eventually brought away in handcuffs in the summer of 2023, neighbors saw merely an elderly man being escorted out of a small house in New Mexico. But at that moment, he was more than a suspect. He was a live reminder of what decades of quiet can hide, and of how far science and justice are ready to stretch. And when he stood inside a Dallas County courthouse in March 2024, weak, chained, and bereft of the peaceful life he had established in the shadows, he did something that no technology could compel, no investigator could demand, and no witness could deliver. He said the truth. He pled guilty to the murder of his own sister-in-law, a crime committed almost 4 decades before, a crime that had broken a family and tormented detectives over the years. That guilty plea was more than an acknowledgement. It was a tribute to the truth that the past does not remain buried, no matter how many years pass. Because this is the unassailable truth. You can hide from people. You can hide from cops. You may even hide from time itself. But you cannot hide from DNA. It waits. It watches. It remains in the threads of a garment, the edge of a knife, the trace of blood left behind in a desperate battle. It does not forget. It does not forgive. And one day, whether it's a year, a decade, or almost 40 years later, it will tell the narrative you thought would never be told. For Barbara Villarreal, that narrative finally reached the light. For her family, justice did not come soon, but it arrived. And for Dallas County, the name Laborio Canales will forever signify the case that demonstrated time cannot quiet the truth. So let the last message resonate, not just for this case, but for every unresolved file still languishing in the cold case drawers of America. DNA never dies, and justice, while it may be delayed, will always find a way. Barbara Fay's story illustrates one thing. Time may pass, but the truth will always rise. Her name nearly sank into the hush of unresolved crimes. But today, justice finally spoke. Don't allow her memory, or the memories of others like her, slip into forgotten archives. By subscribing, you're not only supporting this channel, you're helping keep these victims' voices alive. So ask yourself, if you've seen this far, felt the weight of this tale, and yet chose not to act, what does it say? Do the right thing. Subscribe, share, and make sure Barbara Fay's story, and many others still waiting for justice, are never forgotten again.